All right. Good evening. I'm Chuck, and Brock is with me, and we are doing generous theology. This is a discussion that we've entitled The Generous Theology of Herman Bavinck. On many of the days that we get together and meet, we've been studying the theology of specifically of Herman Bavinck. But on our alternate days, and this is one of those alternate days, we've also been reading some other books. And lately, we've been reading a book entitled The Oxford Handbook of Reformed Theology. And it's been a really interesting read, Brock. We started, rather than starting at the beginning and just reading chapter by chapter, we started by taking a look at some of the chapters in the section entitled Texts. That dealt with many of the most important texts of the Reformed faith. We talked about the institutes of the Christian religion. We talked about the three forms of unity. We spoke of some writings by people like John Owen and Francis Turretin, and then Friedrich Schleiermacher. And now, having done that, we are turning over to the next section in the book, which actually is the final part, other than just a conclusion. It's part 3, entitled Topics and Themes, and it takes up nearly half of the book. It is a fairly hefty section, and we are on the first chapter of that part, albeit the 23rd chapter in the book, and it is a chapter entitled Prolegomena. Now, you might think, wait, Prolegomena, chapter 23, what, huh? At least if you have read, whether it's Bavinck or other theologians, you often see that there's Prolegomena at the beginning, because that's what Prolegomena sort of is. It is sort of the first things in a theological treatise. And actually, the writer of this section, Gijsbert van den Brink, spends some time talking about what does it really mean to have Prolegomena, and is it even appropriate for theological treatises to have Prolegomena, or should we just be jumping right in because is it possible that when we do introductions, what we're doing is trying to sort of connect the topic about which we are going to write with a more general topic, or a different topic, and is that really appropriate when we're talking about systematic theology, given that we often will say, at least in the Reformed world, that theology is done solely on the basis of God as creator and people as creation, and to sort of begin with sort of a more general form of, well, let's talk about religion in general, and then let's get to the more specific Christianity. Van den Brink makes the point that maybe isn't necessarily the way that Reformed thinkers really think about these things. On the other hand, he points out that many Reformed writers have, in fact, included Prolegomena, first things, and in their writings. And so that's what this chapter is all about. Even though it is not the first chapter in the book, it is the first chapter in this section, and it is, I think, an important chapter to be reading. Now, Brock, I kind of want to throw it to you here in just a second, because what I have to say is that before you and I started reading together, I don't know that I ever actually paid attention to the term Prolegomena, the definition of it. Now, in reading Bavinck, there is some discussion of that term. The entire first volume of Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics is entitled Prolegomena, and so it made sense that we would talk about it in that regard. But it's not, I think when I had seen the word before, I just kind of passed over it, saw the word proleg, kind of like prologue, saw that it was at the beginning of the book, generally saw that many of the topics covered in these Prolegomena were sort of a foundational or introductory nature. And there is a difference between foundational and introductory. And Van den Brink, I think, would say that that's a really important distinction. But I think I always just sort of glossed over it. But I remember you, Brock, making a statement very early in some of our discussions that kind of struck me and made me start thinking and sort of diving into this a little bit, which is how much you love Prolegomena and how much you love reading them, and how important they are in sort of how you understand the various writings of which you've read. And so I think perhaps, even though I'm giving the introduction here, I'm giving the Prolegomena to our episode here, I think there's a sense in which maybe you should have been the one to do that, because I think you've had a little bit more of a deeper thought, I think, about Prolegomena and what it means, and what is the relationship of Prolegomena to theological writing and to writing about God and writing about the relationship between God and his creatures. So I'm interested, first of all, Brock, in sort of your thoughts about the word, the Prolegomena, and how you've sort of bounced off that word. And then perhaps if you want to sort of jump in a little bit into what Van den Brink says in this chapter as well, I'd be interested in that.
Yeah, my friend, that's such a generous introduction. Thank you. Prolegomena, I sometimes jokingly pronounce it Prolegomena, because it's such an unusual term for people not familiar with the topic. What's a Prolegomena? And what does that even matter? What does it have to do with theology? And great questions. It turns out, in my own experience, to be crucial. And crucial in sort of one of two different ways. So first of all, you talked about the distinction between being foundational and being introductory. There's great worth in exploring those two things. They're not the same. A good foundation is essential to a structure's success. A bad foundation, it's going to fall over. So there are things we, as students of theology, need to learn to lay a good foundation for our education. And then at the same exact time, Prolegomena also have that introductory aspect to them, because we're new. When we're students, when we're young, when we're first getting into the study, we're fresh, we're new. That's oftentimes very good in terms of some things, like enthusiasm, like in terms of having a hunger to learn. But very quickly we find out that there's so much to learn. And on top of that, how do we organize things in our mind so that the important things remain the important things, so that we major in the majors instead of majoring in the minors, and so that also ultimately our intellectual inquiry is supporting a personal relationship with God, revealed to us through the study of the Holy Scriptures. And so Prolegomena, properly done, is the scaffolding that supports everything that we do as students of theology. Now, the thing about scaffolding is that it's not the final thing. We don't just learn Prolegomena to learn Prolegomena, except for Prolegomenists who have a pedagogical interest. So seminary professors, seminary deans, they study Prolegomena for Prolegomena's sake, so that they could organize a curriculum, organize an educational pathway. Now, for the average student, though, we just need to know about Prolegomena so that we can bootstrap ourselves into this complicated world. There's a professor, the professor cites, I think it's Bart, with a really great working definition of the word prolegomena. And that is things that have to be said in advance. So when you're bootstrapping, when you're getting started, you can't just start from where you're at. You have to assess where you are as a student, and then you have to assess where are the people I'm learning from? Where are the teachers who are helping me? How do I get to understand them as quickly as possible? Now, the anglicization of language in the last 100 years is quite a thing. Chuck, the world is perhaps in East and West as unified in language in our lifetime, in the contemporary period we're in right now. It's perhaps more unified in language than it has ever been since the Tower of Babel. And that means that we have access to a wealth of resources in the English language for studying theology, for being exposed to different kinds of theology, for interacting with people from different theological schools. We have it better now than we ever have. In the past, this knowledge was much more difficult to obtain. Just even in Professor Bobink's day, there's a real high point in his accomplishment to know about all the movements that Professor Bobink studies and relates in his Reformed dogmatics that we've talked about. There's the standard ministry degree, which is a Master's of Divinity, is based around two main parts. The first part tends to be learning the languages, the original languages of the Holy Scriptures. So this means if you're a seminary student studying Hebrew, studying Greek, it's very difficult to become a high-level student of theology without having that access. The other half of the MDiv tends to be around dogmatics and systematics, as well as maybe a pastoral theology, where you're learning how to bring the truths of Scripture down to people. And at the end of the day, Chuck, that's really where Prolegomena shines. People who study Prolegomena want to make the beautiful truths of Scripture, which are so hard to acquire, require so much effort, so much work. Prolegomena is the science of making that more accessible to the next generation. Chuck, if things work out, the students you have, the students I have, will have it easier because we've organized the material that we've talked about and put it into easier to consume settings. That's what this podcast is about. Taking the cookies off of the top shelf and bringing them down to where average people can enjoy their blessing, just like we have. Chuck, I've talked about how I've read Professor Bobink for 10 years. And most of that was volume 1 on Prolegomena. What student wants to dedicate 10 years of his or her life to simply reading through the basics of how to get started? And yet, if you want to be well-read, educated in theology, this is probably the path you want to take. And so I love how this chapter, I'm going to compare it and contrast it with the previous chapter that we read and discussed in our last session, which was the chapter on Friedrich Schleiermacher by Professor Poe. Here, Professor Van den Brink has given us some amazing things. This is some of the best Reformed theology I have found in this volume so far. I was so impressed. In particular, the first section, the introduction, thought was a wonderful way to introduce Prolegomena in a helpful way. The second section, the reformers, I think the professor states the classic issues that make learning theology such a challenge and why Reformed theologians have sort of come out in the way that they have. And then in section 3 on Reformed Orthodoxy, the professor takes a left turn into Albuquerque, which is an old Bugs Bunny saying from my generation, which means after having done so amazingly well in those first few sections, he then takes and devotes an entire section that's focused towards making Friedrich Schleiermacher sort of the father of modern Reformed theology. And having just read Professor Poe's treatment last week, I'm sitting here reading that section and I'm going, really? Really? First of all, in my circles, not that my circles are all circles, but in 25 years of study, in the Reformed circles I've gone in, no one has claimed Schleiermacher. And in fact, everyone in my circles sees him as an enemy of Reformed theology. So I ask the professors in this Oxford Handbook, what is the fascination with trying to put Schleiermacher inside of the Reformed tent? We'll have to talk about that. Then finally, after going through all of those things, we have his idea of how he thinks Prolegomena ultimately help serve the church. And where he sounds very Reformed earlier in the chapter, by the time we get to the end, he sounds practically modern. He sounds practically liberal. And that was a big reveal to me, because I respect what this professor has to say in this chapter. I was doing some research on him before tonight's session. I wanted to find out his quote-unquote Reformed bona fides. And I'm not throwing him out of Reformed theology, but Chuck, I'm very suspicious after what I've found. There's a lot of great information here in terms of accuracy, knowing the right names, knowing the major issues. The professor's all over it in the first part of this chapter. And then it all becomes Schleiermacher Barth, Schleiermacher Barth, Schleiermacher Barth in this dialectic step. And I think, Chuck, we're starting to see a pattern in this Oxford Handbook, very disturbing one for paleo Calvinists like myself. So that's the high-level overview. We still have a lot to talk about here, but let me throw it over to you. Chuck, how did you start to react as you're reading through this chapter? How did the progression of the different sections hit you? And what did you think about some of the specifics in them?
Yeah, thanks for that question. You know, I think some of my reaction was similar to yours in that the introduction and sort of his discussion of especially the earlier Reformed thinkers just struck me as spot on in a lot of ways, and more so than that, because spot on almost makes it sound like, oh yeah, everything he said I agree with, and I knew that at the start. But rather, what I would say, it was spot on because as I read through it, it opened my eyes to some things and got me thinking about some things that perhaps I hadn't thought deeply enough about. And even just that idea of whether Prolegomena ought to be a part of Reformed theological writing is not something I had really ever thought of as somebody who trained as an English major. You write with, an introduction and a conclusion, and you make your points in between. You make your thesis statement. It's just natural. That's the way we're taught to write. So why wouldn't somebody write that way? And in fact, we often have some difficulty understanding writers from other eras where that wasn't necessarily the way things were. Medieval writers they were starting to move in that direction. Even the early moderns didn't always quite follow that way of thinking. And if we go even further back, it's really interesting to me, and it's really opened my eyes to study different ways that the Jewish writers organized their thoughts, and how things like chiasms and things like that, which aren't a part of the way we write, except for maybe in poetry, are really a part of the Hebrew mind and things that we have to pay attention to. But in our modern culture, we just automatically think, yeah, you have an introduction, you introduce your topic. That how else is anybody going to understand what you have to say? So that thought was interesting. I too was struck by how much he seemed to want to bring Schleiermacher into, maybe not so much into the fold. He makes some comments that say, okay, I get it. Not everybody thinks that Schleiermacher's that great. And there's a lot of people who feel like that he really doesn't belong. But, maybe he does. And here's how he's connected. And this is why we should pay attention. And that kind of, especially after our most recent discussion, kind of like, interesting how we get there. And especially given our last chapter, really, Professor Poe really hit on Barth as being in conflict with Schleiermacher, being a critic of Schleiermacher, whereas Van den Brink, while he doesn't say that Barth and Schleiermacher see eye to eye in things by any means, there's also an attempt maybe to synthesize them a little bit. And I found that also to be interesting. And then, of course, his last section, I enjoyed just simply because he was talking about people like Nick Walterstorff and Alvin Plantinga, who are people that I know well. Nick Walterstorff, I've talked to personally and have met, and I know many of his lectures on a number of topics, but especially on education and Christian education, were very formative to my parents. And Plantinga, of course, as well. And these are guys that are kind of rock stars in my Christian Reformed tradition. People. In fact, they're such rock stars that at our last synod there were discussions about, can anybody be more Christian Reformed than Alvin Plantinga? And when someone said he thought he was, that led to almost a huge blow up, which was kind of funny, kind of amusing in some ways. But talking about some of the things that Plantinga and Walterstorff have been talking about in terms of Reformed epistemology and whether Christian belief needs a foundation in natural theology in order to be warranted. Those are issues I've thought about and have had some experience in reading a little bit about, and him sort of ending up other than just the prospect section on that was really interesting to me. There's one other thing I wanted to mention just right at the very beginning in his introduction. Brock, you've occasionally talked about the fact that there there can, you've really wanted us to be generous theologians, right? We named the podcast The Generous Theology of Herman Bavinck, and we've often talked about the need to be generous because sometimes in the Reformed world that doesn't always happen. I sometimes refer to some of those less generous people as the Theo bros. I think other people have other terms that they've used, but I kind of loved what Van den Brink talked about. He called it an example of the dreaded rabies theologorum, or the fury of theologians against one another on issues that everyone else takes for granted, which, that would be like the opposite of generous theology. It would be a theology of the rabies theologorum. We'll probably avoid that, but perhaps in the future when we refer to some of these conflicts that sometimes happen in the Reformed world, maybe we'll use that terminology, rabies theologorum. I don't know. I just got a kick out of that when I read it. So I wanted to mention that. But yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that introduction. We've sort of hit on it somewhat already, but this sensitive issue of whether a systematic theologian should add an introduction when he sets about to write a coherent account of the contents of the Christian faith. And what does that mean when one writes Prolegomena, when one writes an introduction, and that difference between simply an introduction or versus laying a foundation. And I think that is an important issue. The Van den Brink states here that is it really, or he asks the question, is it really the case that we can only understand the Christian faith by approaching it as a special instance of some other more generally phenomenon? Would we not end up with a highly distorted picture in this way? And I think he makes a really important point here. Such an external starting point, he says, one might surmise easily, if not unavoidably, slants one's take on the issue, and that it does not let the Christian faith stand on its own feet. It threatens to transform it into some construct that is more palatable to our pre-established intuitions, wishes, and in the worst case, even ideologies. And I think, especially given where this chapter goes at some point, that's sort of an interesting take. Van den Brink then goes to Barth, who very much sort of seems to be a proponent of the idea that Prolegomena, you have to be really careful about Prolegomena. He doesn't totally eliminate it, but Van den Brink says, in Barth's view, an introduction to the Christian faith can only be conceived of as part of the exposition of the faith. He doesn't oppose the possibility and appropriateness of Prolegomena altogether, but he insists that in Protestant dogmatic, Prolegomena should themselves have a dogmatic rather than a pre-dogmatic character. And that's where the quote that you mentioned is brought out. More broadly, Barth is quoted as saying, Prolegomena to dogmatics are only possible as part of dogmatics itself. The syllable pro in the word prolegomena is to be understood figuratively. What is in question is not the things that must be said previously, but the things that must be said first. And that again is sort of an interesting distinction. And as we open up sort of this chapter, there is this really important question of what is the purpose of Prolegomena and how do we use it properly? And then he goes on to talk about some of the other writers in sort of the Reformed tradition and what they've done. And we'll get into some of those because I think it's really important to consider what people like John Calvin, for example, did in that regard. But I'm interested, Brock, in if you were to tomorrow decide that you're going to start writing your own systematic theology, your own 4-volume magnus opus, sort of akin to Bavinck, sort of a Brock Bavinck for the 21st century, would you would you struggle with the idea of whether to even include Prolegomena? Would you want to have a fourth of the entire Magnus Opus be considered Prolegomena, like it has with Bavinck, or like some other writers, including John Calvin, who sort of seem to kind of jump right in? Not that there's no foundational things there, but the foundational things are really determined by what is discussed first, rather than introducing what is coming first. I wonder if you've ever thought about that issue.
It's funny you should say that. Prolegomena is one of my joys. But you have to ask yourself really what it's all about. And at the end of the day, I find that I need more Prolegomena, more setup, more backstory, more introduction. When I'm speaking to people who have a much more distant worldview, understanding of reality than I do. So if I'm speaking with Reformed people, I oftentimes have to do very little Prolegomena before we can sort of get into the weeds and talk about things. Why? Because we have a shared culture, we have a shared language. We have so much of a shared understanding. And so I would coordinate and dial around that for Prolegomena. I think everybody should understand, have a sense for who their audience is. And when the audience is close, as in the case of Calvin, I think very little Prolegomena is necessary. But when the audience is far and the distance is great, then I think you have to overcome some of that separation. And that's really what Prolegomena is about in its best form. So for anybody wondering, how much should I study First Things or Prolegomena? Or if you're a teacher, a pedagogue, how much should I dedicate in my presentations? I think that's going to be one of the most important guiding questions, is how close is your audience? How big is your audience? Very specialized audiences can get away. You can get away with a lot. But audiences that are very sort of generic, broad and general, talking to people with simpler understandings of theology, you want to take a different approach. And neither is bad. It's not like there's no one right or wrong way to do Prolegomena. You and I were talking, Chuck, before we started, about how Reformed people oftentimes have this, there is the one right way to do something, approach and attitude. And there are some things that's good for, but there are lots of things, in fact, maybe most things, that is not good for. And I want to give warriors for Christ a different perspective on this. A lot of Calvinists have been very static in their thinking and not very sort of dynamic. And if there's one thing that I like about modern attempts from people like Professor Vanderbrink, who at this point in time, he has impressed me with some of his Reformed knowledge. As a matter of fact, I was so deeply impressed with sections 23.2 and 23.3. I thought they could have been written by a Reformed professor and could be read by any student of Reformed theology as if by someone having an internal position. And then there are just a couple of places where the professor makes a left turn into something that is face palmy and kind of takes it over the edge, and you just kind of go, wow. and you realize where people really are with things now. I want to maybe say it this way. Let me go back. You go back into the start of the section here. He talks about Prolegomena as a topic under the Scriptura Sacra, which is sacred scripture. And then he says this, in a brief prospect, now this is the end of the chapter. He says, in a brief prospect at the end of this chapter, we will suggest some of the tasks and functions which any future Reformed Prolegomena may fulfill when? After the demise of classical foundationalism. Let me read that again. We will suggest some of the tasks and functions which any future Reformed Prolegomena may fulfill after what? The demise of classical foundationalism. What does the professor mean by that? You can sort of read that and skip over. Oh, he means something very technical. No, friends, what he means is he means the end of the importance of the confessions and creeds to Reformed theology. It means nothing else than that. Stop encumbering Reformed theology with creeds and confessions. Westminster Confession of Faith. Go out. You've had your day. The kind of classical foundationalism that you present is no longer wanted. Baptist 1689. Out. And I start to see the professor is articulating that. Great. He's throwing out the classic Reformed creeds and confessions while still wanting to be, quote unquote, Reformed. So what then does he want to replace it with? Can you guess? The answer to me is not necessarily in this essay. This is why I was looking up some of his other writings. One of his other books is entitled, and this is of course a team book. He's one of the editors. And it's called Progress in Theology. Does the Queen of the Sciences advance? That's going to be the open question. Creedalism is broken. We now have to go back to something. We now have to move on to something better. What's the something better? Chucky's already articulated it here. And that's these dialectic steps between Schleiermacher-Barth, Schleiermacher-Barth, Schleiermacher-Barth. And not that it's always going to be one of those two theologians. It's going to be lots of other theologians. But what is it not going to be? What are you not going to see from this movement? And this, by the way, infuriates me from somebody who claims to be Reformed. It's not going to be. The Westminster Confession of Faith says this in chapter 6, section 1. The 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith says this in chapter 3, section 1. Why? Because the professor rejects them. Think about that. The anti-creedal professor of Reformed theology, where he thinks it's a move of progress to have moved past this classical foundationalism, which has been discredited. He says it in the essay, in this chapter. Immanuel Kant destroyed it. No need to stay with that anymore. And then we're going to be back on the roller coaster of the dialectic between Barth and Schleiermacher, or whoever is going to take us further down that path. This is classic Wissenschaft. I see it in one of the professor's other books. It's entitled Test All Things, the Bible, Faith, and Science. And he compares these ideas that are being communicated. He references words in the King James that have traditional meanings, contextual, historical understandings. Words like wisdom, instruction, understanding, justice, judgment, equity, subtlety, knowledge, discretion, wise counsel, interpretation, dark sayings, fear of the Lord, beginning. And he wants to suggest that there are better phrases. There are better, more modern, dialectically informed. Remember our dance with Bart and Schleiermacher? Schleiermacher and Bart dancing across the dance floor? He suggests instead of wisdom, we might just speak about the art of living. Instead of looking for instruction, we might look for criticism or correction. Criticism, of course, he means in a modern and potentially a postmodern sense. Instead of understanding, perhaps it's also possible to consider discernment. And it goes down through the list. And he's replaced all of those good King James Version words with options like moral integrity, honesty, impartiality, thoughtfulness, understanding, perceptiveness, deliberation, explanation, hidden meanings. He replaces fear of the Lord with respect for God. He replaces beginning with principle, nucleus, or foundation. He talks about these key words. What's my point? Whatever the professor's doing looks to this Reformed person like he's replacing A with B. Out with the old, in with the new. Keep as much of the structure and language for nostalgic and historical purposes as necessary, but fill those words with new, modern, and postmodern meaning. And in that sense, that's exactly what I have feared with these Oxford handbooks, and especially this one on our own Reformed theology. Imagine reading the Oxford Handbook of Reformed Theology and then interacting with people like us, Chuck, you and I, confessionally Reformed for 20 plus years each. And then someone says to you, "Oh, Chuck, that's so nice that you talk about those confessions and creeds from antiquity, but that's not what Reformed theology is. Reformed theology is this pas de deux, this dance between Bart and Schleiermacher. Get on board, Chuck. This Paleo-Calvinism, you keep going back to these old documents that have been discredited. It's not a good look. I recognize that's a harsh indictment. And honestly, I did not want to find that. I wanted to find another Reformed theologian with a very different viewpoint from my own. And I think I'm starting to get the sense and impression that many, if not most, of the professors writing in this volume are going to be with Professor Vandenbrink. And contra the classic creedal confessionalism that you and I represent. And that is going to be so interesting to triangulate around. And we will, Chuck. I mean, that's part of why we're doing this. You know, you and I talked about this danger when we were going to look into the volume. Chuck, are we going to find a bunch of postmodernism, LARPing, dressed up in costume, as if it were just another species of Reformed theology? Or are we going to find something else? Let's continue going through things, but I just want to point out to people that there is a big gap here. And with Professor Poe's essay last week on Schleiermacher, I thought to myself, wow, it's really getting out in the open. And then now in this chapter, we have from the professor, he actually writes in the essay, Chuck, you saw it. It was up to the great Reformed theologian of the 19th century, Friedrich Schleiermacher, My false teeth fell out of my mouth when I saw that he wrote that. Of course, I don't have false teeth. But if I had false teeth, they'd fall out. I was astonished at this. There really is. I don't want to say appropriation, because who's right? Who, quote unquote, owns Reformed theology? I'm sure that the authors in the Oxford Handbook are going to say that perhaps they have the more authentic one. Let's hear them out. That's why we're reading this handbook. But I was just shocked, Chuck, to sort of see it happen. I've known about its presence, but it's always been sort of anecdotal. It's been sort of not really pinned downable. Oh, we love the Reformed tradition just like you. We just have a slightly different perspective. No, my friends, if Schleiermacher's the great Reformed theologian who saved Reformed theology from Kant, no, my friend, you have a different understanding of what Reformed theology is than I do. And so, Chuck, that's a big statement. That's a big issue here. In your own thinking, did you see it in that drastic of a light? If so, where do we go? If not, what were some of the mediating ideas that brought it back in your mind?
Yeah, thanks. I don't know that I saw it quite as starkly as you did. And maybe it's because I took a somewhat different view of what Van den Brink meant when he talked about the demise of classical foundationalism. And to be fair, when I reviewed this section, I had just listened to a discussion that was done by the folks on the Reformed Forum. They have a podcast, an occasional podcast on the Reformed Forum called Philosophy for Theologians. And in it, there's a number of people who are on that podcast, Camden Busey and Jared Oliphant and some others. And I had just listened to some discussion of a comparison of Van Til with Bavinck and also Van Til with Alvin Plantinga. And in that discussion, they used classical foundationalism as a way of describing the idea that you can justify your beliefs by relying on a foundation of directly justified beliefs, which aren't justified by any other beliefs. These basic foundational beliefs are either considered to be self-evident or they're evident to the senses, and there was some discussion about whether that's even appropriate or not. But they talked a little bit about Plantinga's view of warranted belief and how do you warrant your beliefs? Can certain beliefs be warranted because of the way that you hold them without necessarily justifying them with other beliefs? And at some point you can't get any further. And it is my sense that, and Van den Brink doesn't, I actually looked, and he does not refer to Cornelius Van Til at all in his bibliography here. So that made me think a little bit about whether this is truly what he was talking about. But I just wondered whether what maybe Van den Brink was talking about is, in the Reformed world, a move more towards Van Tilian presuppositionalism, this idea that we start with a commitment to the Christian worldview, including the existence of God, the authority of Scripture, and that is really where we begin, and we need to go no further. as opposed to Plantinga's, warranted beliefs, where there's this concept of still finding a warrant for those beliefs. Now, I will also say I don't know that there's a stark gap between Plantinga and Van Til, but there is a somewhat of a difference in perspective and in where do you begin? What are the Prolegomena for Van Til versus the Prolegomena for Plantinga? And I took Hunt and Brink to maybe be taking the position that perhaps it was Van Til's way of thinking that is winning the day in the Reformed world over Plantinga's. The other, on top of that, I also considered, beyond merely the Reformed world, but in the world in general, postmodernism, and you referred to this, postmodernism really is opposed to this classical foundationalism, this idea that we have justification for our beliefs, ultimately relying on a foundation of directly justified beliefs, and that we keep going down for. And at some point, postmodernists say you can't do that anymore. It just doesn't work. There are no base beliefs. You have to start with something, or there is nothing. And many postmodernists, because of that, have become nihilists. And nothing, you can't believe in anything. There's no foundation for anything. It just cuts it completely out. Now, not all postmodernists are there, but that does seem to be the general direction in secular postmodernism, is to move to a sort of form of nihilism. And that also does seem to be winning the day. So I didn't necessarily take Van den Brink's comment as being supportive of the idea automatically that nihilism and postmodernism is going to win the day, and that's a good thing, but rather more of a commentary on what we see happening in the world today. And given I did a little bit of looking into Van den Brink and where he's at the Free University in Amsterdam, and yeah, the Free University isn't today what it was during Kuyper's heyday. That's for sure. Things are quite different there. And even the church, Van den Brink is a pastor in the Protestant Church of the Netherlands, which is sort of the merger of a number of Reformed, but also other than Reformed denominations. In some ways, it is maybe a little later in time, but very akin to the United Church of Christ here in the United States, or the United Church of Canada in Canada, where it's sort of an amalgamation of a lot of different views, of which Reformed views sort of took up a piece of it, maybe even a large piece of it, but over time the amalgamation has sort of watered things down to some extent, and to the point where that there are churches leaving the Protestant Church of the Netherlands and either moving into some of the more historical Reformed churches or creating their own new organizations, their new federations and things like that. So given that I took Van den Brink to mean that, I didn't necessarily go all the way to the idea that all of this knowledge at the beginning is just, and all this really good stuff that he talks about in these sections on the Reformed reformers and on the Orthodox reformers and Reformed Orthodoxy and what they say about Prolegomena. I didn't take then that to mean that his later comments about Schleiermacher were just simply sort of his true colors coming out, that he wants to toss out all of Reformed Orthodoxy. Now, to be sure, I think from what I know of Van den Brink, he's still within the Reformed world, at least within the American Dutch Reformed world, he would probably still be considered to be, pretty far over and perhaps not as orthodox as some. But it didn't strike me that he was necessarily, falling totally into, the utter sort of nihilism or of postmodernism, or perhaps the utter, the sort of the worst of modernism either, but rather, his wanting to bring Schleiermacher into the fold struck me more as a move of saying, hey, let's broaden this. Let's look at, people like Schleiermacher who were impacted by Reformed thinking, and let's see how they're impacting the Reformed world. Not to say that I necessarily agree with all of his conclusions in that particular section, but that maybe colored how I saw what Fontaine-Brink was saying about Prolegomena and later parts of his chapter, based on his comment about the demise of classical foundationalism. Which, by the way, when I read that phrase, it really did strike me, and I needed to spend some time thinking about what does he mean there, because it isn't necessarily automatically obvious by any means. So yeah, that was it's a really interesting discussion, because whether he's sort of gone off the deep end, the postmodern deep end in some ways, or whether he is just a more broadly less orthodox, broadly modern or postmodern version of sort of the Dutch Reformed tradition, probably does make a difference on how seriously we take his conclusions at the end. And so I think it's an important discussion to have is where does he fall on these things? And now I will say, unlike you, I didn't go and read a lot of his other, or get information about a lot of his other writings. I limited it to just simply what I knew here, and spent some time thinking about classical foundationism. And as I pointed out too, the fact that he didn't mention Van Til at all was a little of a concern to me, but I also am aware that perhaps Van Til and that and Van Til's presuppositionalism has not had as much of an impact in Europe as it has in North America. I think Van Til is much more, not that people aren't reading him in Europe, but I think he's much more impactful in the American context. Whereas I think Plantinga maybe is still has a level of impact in Europe. Although I also do have this impression that sometimes our Dutch cousins kind of think of us Americans as a little bit their their country cousins, kind of like, hey, you guys, we know a little better than you do, but and I do sometimes get that impression, and so maybe American thinkers aren't really going to be taken that seriously anywhere in Europe. But I don't know. Any thoughts about that? Am I having the wool pulled over my eyes here, Brock, in sort of thinking that way about what Van den Brink might have been thinking here?
My friend, maybe. Let me try to be generous, even as I offer some of the most pointed language. Like Schleiermacher, Van den Brink needs to be read, needs to be considered and responded to from high-level pedagogues, high-level historians of Reformed theology, like you and I aspire to be, Chuck. Let me do that. Let me say that we aspire. But at the same point in time, the professor really looks to me like a contemporary Schleiermacher. I found another writing of his, another essay called Theology and Evolution. And in one paragraph, he responds to my position by saying this. He says, in any case, it is clear that the ancient creationist battle cry, no Adam, no fall, no fall, no atonement, no atonement, no Savior, is misleading. Now here he's talking about a measured approach to the biblical testimony given in its traditional prima facie historical understanding. And he says this: the Christian acknowledgement that we humans are sinners in need of redemption does not depend on a detailed account of how we came to be so. Therefore, he says, Christian soteriology need not be diluted if we assume that humanity came into existence through evolutionary processes. Let me read that again. The Christian acknowledgement that we humans are sinners in need of redemption does not depend on a detailed account of how we came to be. But Professor, we have an account, a detailed account of how we became so. Good grief, man! Not only is the professor throwing out the creeds and the confessions while claiming to be this new Reformed theology, he's saying that the testimony of the scriptures themselves are not instrumental in our theological understanding. Now, I'm not just saying, oh, the professor's not agreeing with my creation view, so he's out. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, look at the disregard. He speaks in the abstract. The Christian acknowledgement that we humans are sinners in need of redemption does not depend upon a detailed account. Professor, what are you reading then to get your ideas that we humans are sinners in need of redemption? It could be anything. Christian soteriology will not be diluted if we assume that humanity came into existence through evolutionary processes. This is where it's going. This is where the Wissenschaften is going. This is my fear for the majority of essayists in this Oxford Handbook. My worry, my fear, is that the majority of them are exactly where Professor Vandenbrink is. And that's troubling. Now, in his bibliography, the professor cites an article from the Blackwell Companion to the Philosophy of Religion by Nicholas Wolterstorff called The Reformed Tradition. I want to read that. You and I have talked about Wolterstorff before, positively. I want to read that because there are good and right mentions of legitimate Reformed thinkers here. Now, Wolterstorff, to my mind and understanding, is not quote-unquote Reformed, but he's someone I have great respect for. Other authors mentioned in here that the professor uses would include David Steinmetz, Willem van Hasselt, Alvin Plantinga, Richard Muller, Heinrich Hepp. And these are folks with a great Reformed pedigree. Additionally, of course, he mentions Herman Bavinck, Hendrikus Berkhoff, a G.C. Berkouwer, personal hero of mine. Of course, John Calvin, Then he mentions others who seem outside of that fold. Wolfhart Pannenberg, Alvin Plantinga. Of course, we mentioned Friedrich Schleiermacher and others. What an interesting situation this is for you and I, Chuck, to go through, read this professor, make the most generous assessment that we can, and engage with his ideas. But at the same point in time, I am absolutely shocked and amazed at theologians who reason the way he does in that paragraph that I just read. I'm going to read it one more time. I'm sorry, Chuck. I really don't mean to be gauche here. The Christian acknowledgement that we humans are sinners does not depend on a detailed account of how we came to be so. We humans are sinners, and that knowledge does not depend on a detailed account of how we became to be so. If I have heard something less educated, less capable, less theologically adequate, I'm in a rough spot to think of it. That is terrible theology. Look, I have to step back here, Chuck. We want to keep things generous. I absolutely do. But we don't want our viewers to drink poison either. And I am afraid in this new Wissenschaften Reformed theology, I am afraid of poison like this. I'm afraid of the fact that they won't engage with the entire 20th century of paleo-reformed theologians. John Murray, Cornelius Van Til, so many others. I'm afraid that I read chapter after chapter in which the creeds and confessions are almost nothing. And when they are something, they're items of historical interest only, not dogmatic, not doctrinal. That sounds like a Reformed theology that is not Reformed theology to me. And I would be very concerned for somebody who picks up a volume like this and thinks, wow, I really want to learn what it means to be a Calvinist. I don't think that this is going to lead them in a wholesome direction. Let me throw it over to you, Chuck, for some final thoughts, maybe a grounding statement or two, depending on where, how these things strike you, and then close with a prayer, because, I think we need it for this for this section today.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that, Brock. I think again, my reaction to those quotes, and I also have pulled up an interview that Ben and Brink did with Eerdmans, the bookseller, on his book Reformed Theology and Evolutionary Theory. And what he said there struck me as less of an attack on whether or not we are sinners and whether or not we are in need of salvation, but more of an acknowledgement that he is not a classical foundationalist, and that he does not see the need to back up particular beliefs by constantly going further and further into the next warranted belief, the basis for doing so. Now, we can question whether that's the right way to do things, but there is a sense that in many ways his approach, while it comes to different conclusions, still has some comparison with the technique of Cornelius Van Til. Now, what I really wish, and I've been searching without any sort of success. What I really wish is that we could find some engagement between Van den Brink and the writings of Van Til, because I think that would be really helpful in sort of figuring out, in which side of this Van den Brink really falls. But it is hard to say that Van Til really is a classical foundationalist. Now there are some who would say that he still has some of the basics of that approach. Most people who would say that are really trying to point out that Van Til is not in any way moving towards that very postmodern, hopelessly agnostic way of thinking, lacking any kind of confidence regarding the veracity of our knowing. Van Til isn't a relativist. He does have a theological framework for making sense of our everyday confidence in our cognitive faculties, and maybe as a result of that, we can say that there's some sense in which Van Til is a foundationalist, but not in a way that is open to sort of this postmodern critique of classical foundationalism. And it would be interesting to see is Van den Brink moving all the way over into that postmodern nihilism, or is he closer to sort of this view of Van Til that says, at some point we don't need to keep justifying because there are certain presuppositions that we can merely rely on. And I don't know. In his interview about this book, Van den Brink makes the comment that what he was really trying to do in this book is to break an impasse. He says that people who come up with arguments in favor of evolution aren't listened to by people who reject the theory, and people who come up with arguments against evolution are rejected by people who believe in evolution. And what he wanted to do is say, okay, well, let's see if this is really all that foundational. And is it possible to hold to all of your Christian beliefs while still holding to an evolution, to sort of the theory of evolution? And that is to say, not necessarily evolutionism as we talk about it, which is an anti-theistic evolution, but just simply evolution in and of itself. Van den Brink is also not a native English speaker, so I don't know how. It's hard sometimes. I feel like I'm putting some words in his mouth in English that maybe aren't there. I don't know whether he wrote this in English or whether he originally wrote it in Dutch and it's in translation. That I don't know, and that might make a difference as well. So there's a sense in which I don't know for sure. But it's something worth thinking about, and frankly, it's got me interested. And yeah, I don't know. I think our discussion today is such that this is a name, Gijsbert van den Brink, that we're going to have to sort of maybe think about even more. And if his picture is to be believed on this Erdman's blog, which does date from a few years ago, it's from 2020, but he looks awfully young. I would guess that he's younger than we are, Brock. So I don't know. Maybe he's just a healthy Hollander, but he may be continuing to write a lot of different things, and it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Before I close in prayer, any final comments?
Yeah, just to say that this really is why we bought this book, why we wanted to read it through. I'm not upset that views like Professor Van den Brink's exist. I think I'm upset about some specific technical reasons. And I have some real particular concerns about the kinds of things that modern movements want to throw out. The things that moderns believe to be no longer necessary. There's a phrase that we grew up with: don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I think that's my biggest concern here. And some people are going to say, the professor doesn't say the things necessarily that you are ascribing to him. And that's true enough. But friends, you get a sense. You get a sense for where people are by carefully listening. And over time, you come to understand that a lot of things are in play in environments like this. So throughout the rest of the Oxford Handbook that we're reading, I want to see just where the other authors value, if they even mention 20th century quote-unquote paleo-Calvinists, as well as the classic creeds and confessions. And I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say the professor we read today is going to be fairly typical, fairly representative. I'd love to be proved wrong. But if that's the case, then I think we're going to see a very stark difference between the Reformed theology of the time of the classic creeds of the confessions and whatever this is in this Oxford Handbook, which at this point I hesitate to call Reformed theology. Back to you, my friend, for our prayer.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Brock. This has been a very interesting and enjoyable discussion. And I'm just going to take some time to thank God for the fact that we can have these discussions. So let's go to God in prayer. Our Father in heaven, you are a great God. You are a God who created all things, created us. But you also created us with the ability to think about who you are, to try to approach you, to learn your ways, to learn your creation, and to think about things, not only just the things that we can touch and see, but also things that we can think deeply about. What does it mean to hold beliefs, and at what point are we warranted in holding those beliefs? And those are difficult concepts, and you've created us with minds that are capable of thinking about those things. And doing that, of course, we are imperfect human beings, and as a result of our imperfection, we often miss the mark. We don't get things right, and there is a wide variety of the way we think about these things. And yet I think there is also a sense in which that variety is something that can still bring glory to you. Not that wrong thinking brings glory to you, because it doesn't, but that the way that we can talk and think about things and the variety of perspectives that we can have on things can paint an even more detailed and colorful picture of the glory of who you are, triune God. And so we thank you that we have the opportunity to have these discussions and to think about these things and to think deeply. I pray that as we think these deep thoughts, that you will continue to cover us with your Spirit so that our thoughts will align as much as possible with yours. We pray this in the name of your precious Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.